نظيره وشفا بتر بصوت صرخة رداني ويا بالحجر ايام سيار بالارض زلزالها يا زينب يا زينب مظلومة ما شاء الله مظلومة يا زينب بعد علي يا زينب يا زينب مظلومة يا زينب بيمين that's ويا ايدي بارك الله فيكم رجون هلا بالافهام بيمين that's immortalize the story of the grief, the lights that universalize Hussein's belief, the chance of Haidar left Sham in disbelief. He only had love will cure the strongest of your grief. Ya Zainab, ya Zainab, mazluma, big mazluma, ya Zainab, Ali ya Zainab, ya Zainab, mazluma, mazluma, ya Zainab, Zainab, طف كربلاء
Well, Orientalism is a term that was made very prominent by the late Edward Said, who was an academic, a Palestinian Christian academic actually, based on the East Coast, near the end of his life, most prominently at Columbia University. And in 1978, he authored a seminal work called Orientalism, looking at the construction, the perception, and the sustainability by the West of images of the East, of the Orient, but primarily of the Arab and the Muslim world. He does this through his expertise in scholarship, which was in comparative literature, looking at European novels, how their text was used to both describe and in many ways justify and perpetuate notions of colonization, notions of imperialism, but at the same time also otherization. Orientalism was, even in its most benign form, a way for the West to quote-unquote study and understand the East, but it did so in a way that exoticized and in many ways inferioritized the East.
So the way American culture is set up, the way that the racialization system is set up is that there's a whiteness at the center and always has been, and anybody who's seen as non-white is on the outside.
You have like an identity crisis basically. Like when I was growing up, I had to define myself as what am I? Am I an American? Am I an Arab? Am I an Arab American? Should I say if I'm a Muslim or not? And so over the years I've gotten to the point where I can say, yeah, I'm an Arab Muslim living here in America.
I mean, identity is, just like foreign policy, a very fluid conceit. And we find that for Arabs and Muslims in the United States, and particularly after 9/11, their own identity construction is constantly and continuously being contested.
For instance, Arab Americans actually, according to the United States government, are white. Anybody who comes from the Arab world or the Middle East checks white on the census box. There is no Arab box, there is no Middle Eastern box. So they're seen as white officially. But almost all Arab Americans will tell you that at some point in their life they were treated as non-white. So the way they construct their identity is in this weird liminal space where officially they're part of this white mainstream, but they're not treated as such. And so the identity they construct is one of, okay, we're not white, but we're also not othered. We're not an enemy. We're not dangerous. We're not all of these things that we've been racialized to be seen as over the last century.
The depiction and the characterization of Arabs and Muslims is something that, of course, predates 9/11 and predates the Cold War. We find that as early as the 1920s in this country, the idea of the exotic, lust-filled sheikh, played by Rudolph Valentino, somebody who wasn't even Arab or Muslim, very much then helped permeate and dominate the construction of the Arab or of the Muslim. So early Hollywood depicted the Muslim as being a magic carpet riding exotic individual or some clumsy nomadic Bedouin type. We find then moving forward the construction of the Arab and the Muslim has become now most dominated by the trope of terrorism or religious fundamentalist or fanatic.
So Arab Americans are also consumers of popular culture. They grew up in America. Even the ones that recently immigrated had Hollywood movies at their fingertips in their home country. So they come here and they automatically know, and the people that were born here know, how they're viewed by the general American public because of the way they're depicted in Hollywood.
It's kind of made me like a bit aware of, my culture a bit more, mainly because like they pick and choose certain things that to me I wouldn't have either thought about or not really cared. So it kind of brings me to perspective, do these things actually exist? So when I go back home and I find that they don't exist, I realize, it was just something that they wanted to make the headline story of. So that kind of makes me feel like I'm being used. I'm not being treated as a person. But when they show things that are true and are actually like good, like how Arabs are generous with food, that to me I can say, yeah, that's true. Because when you come to an Arab household, there is no way you're going to leave unless you gain 10 pounds at minimum.
Now, it's not 100% bad. Not every depiction of an Arab on film is negative, but the vast majority are and have been for nearly a century of Hollywood. So Arab Americans understand that they're seen as different, they're seen as other, and of course it affects the way they view themselves and it affects the way they interact with an American public. They think, oh, I'm seen as suspect. Your movies always depict me as a potential terrorist, and then coupled with that, the American school system rarely teaches accurate representations of Arabs in the Middle East. So then, not only is Hollywood depicting Arabs in a very negative stereotype and negative light, there's no educational counter to that. And so Arab Americans are very aware of this. Some of the paintings that we have today that are known as Orientalist art, you can find them at the DIA, you can find them at MoMA. Any major museum has some of these Orientalist renderings. A lot of them are suspect for their interpretation, as most art is, bound to be an interpretation of the artist. But in many cases, these Orientalist artists were drawing and painting pictures of harems and fanciful scenes of women and Muslims in bazaars and markets and on camels in deserts in the 1700s and 1800s. Many of these artists never actually traveled to that area, but their depictions were based on other artists' depictions and the travel writers who wrote about it and brought it back to Europe. So this is when Edward Said in his 1978 book Orientalism was saying that the idea of what the Orient is, who these Arabs are, was invented by Europeans. He's saying specifically that the images were constructed. They weren't necessarily made to reflect a reality of what was happening. So a lot of these artists, Delacroix is a very famous Orientalist painter, were completely made up, but the impact that they had is that these images were then brought back to Europe and were circulated, and other people, you know, imitated them. They were published in books. They actually became the basis for even today's Hollywood movies. In the 1920s, Hollywood started featuring Arabs and the Middle East as major themes. It started with the movie The Sheikh in the 1920s, starring Rudolph Valentino. A lot of the set design that was done for those movies was based on these European Orientalist interpretations of who the Arabs were. So you can even say that today's Hollywood representations of Arabs is based in 200- and 300-year-old European representations of Arab peoples. So let me give a concrete example. Disney's Aladdin, 1991. One of the most popular Disney films ever. The set design, even though it's an animated film, there's still set design happening. The set design for that, with the big onion-domed buildings, the castles, which are not rooted in any real experience of the Middle East or the Arab world, were taken from the 1926 film The Thief of Baghdad. So you have, 60 years apart, you have Hollywood, what's called, cannibalizing itself, using its own images that it created. That 1926 film, Thief of Baghdad, was completely created out of the minds of the set designer at the time, who was inspired by these Orientalist interpretations of the Arab world, which were not rooted in reality. So it might seem like a paradox, but given the negative backlash that happened after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 towards the Arab and Muslim communities, it was also a galvanizing event where places like the Arab American National Museum came into existence. So the museum was being fundraised for in 2000. That's when they decided, hey, let's build a museum. But it was the attacks of 9/11 and the fallout and the negative depictions of Arabs in media that really galvanized the museum supporters to get it built even quicker.
Well, I'm not sure if it's really improved. Most of the studies and most of the reports show that since 9/11, general attitudes toward Arabs and Muslims has actually declined over the last 13 years.
منهن دليل وقالوا رادت تميل اللي رحالها يا زينب يا زينب مظلومة ما شاء الله مظلومة يا زينب بعد علي يا زينب يا زينب مظلومة women like Zainab, her qualities are flawless. Her suffering has made Karbala a success. Her loneliness has left the Ummah in big distress. To have been through that and to have patience